Hey, Dr. Mitch here. Just wanted to get into what's passing for the gateway theory lately. If you happen to be in my class, there are questions on this on the final exam. Take home message allegedly, folks move from one drug to another, and it's been misunderstood that somehow the previous drug is the cause of the subsequent drug's use. Obviously, there's a problem with this argument. Nevertheless, we do notice folks uh, co-vary in their drug use in the sense that people who like to use drugs like to use drugs. So just because you've used cannabis doesn't mean you're going to develop problems with hard drugs. But yeah, folks who've used hard drugs often have used cannabis first. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at the data. And more importantly, let's take a look at how we reason about one thing being a cause of another thing in general. Why is this important? It's got important implications for drug prevention because if we lie to teenagers and say, hey, marijuana is going to make you a heroin addict, of course they're going to laugh right in our faces. And then when we say something true like meth is going to make holes in your brain, not technically, but your brain is going to have bigger ventricles after years of use, they're going to say, hey, aren't you the dork who told me marijuana was a gateway to heroin? And you completely sacrifice your credibility. Oh, my friend Maya Slavovitz, who wrote The Unbroken Brain, said, in fact, she figured, hey, I can handle cannabis, and they told me this was a hard drug, so I can probably handle them all, and then later ended up struggling with cocaine. So obviously, it's better to tell the truth than anything else. So what's the story on the gateway? They used to call it the stepping stone hypothesis. And essentially, it was that one drug led to another drug, and then that led to another drug. The way it's been presented to me is sometimes I think it's folks think that smoking cannabis is some kind of how make you crave heroin or hard drugs the way salt makes you thirsty. So with this idea in mind, really what I'm asking is if by gateway do you mean there's a correlation or do you mean this is a cause? Now, yes, there is a correlation among drug use. People who like to use drugs like to use drugs. But it doesn't mean that one drug then causes the use of another drug. Let's get into that a little bit. Well, so let's take an oddball example. So on the right here, you see a horrible motorcycle accident. And in fact, the guy who rode that motorcycle before he had that accident, he also rode a bicycle. Well, did riding bicycles cause this motorcycle accident? I think that's probably about as absurd as it could get from a causality argument. But in a sense, this is really what we're saying is, hey, if you use cannabis and later you're going to have a heroin problem, the cannabis somehow caused the heroin problem. Oh, here's another intriguing correlation that I'm guessing you won't interpret as causal. The per capita consumption of sour cream correlates with a horrible stat on motorcycle riders killed in non-collision transport accidents. And this correlation is actually higher than the link. This was about a 0.7 if I remember right. Is actually higher than the link between cannabis and hard drug use. I don't think that eating sour cream somehow makes you have a motorcycle accident. Another one of my favorites. This is the divorce rate in New York and the per capita consumption of beef. So as you can see here, eating more beef makes people get divorced. I got a correlation here of 0.72, and truth be told, I got tenure on correlations about half that size, so I don't want to make too big a deal out of this because I don't think eating meat necessarily causes divorces. Let's take a look at what we mean when we say one thing is a cause of another. Well, good old Dave Hume, the British empiricist, 1711 to 1776, and you don't need to know that on a test. Smart guy, and he said, here's how we reason about causality. He's not saying this is the best way to reason about causality, he's just saying this is how humans do it. We need three criteria. We need an association, a direction, and isolation. So association is simply the cause and the effect go together, right? If A causes B, A ought to be there and B ought to be there. With direction, some folks call this temporal antecedents, right? Basically, the cause has to come first, right? So my friend who wrote a paper in the Iowa English program about television's influence on Shakespeare, I had to make fun of that, right? Because Shakespeare obviously never saw a television. We got a temporal antecedents problem, unless old Shakespeare had a time machine I didn't know about. But his paper was actually about how television influenced the way Shakespeare was portrayed in plays, how people staged it. But yes, the cause has to come first. And then finally, isolation. The cause and only the cause is the source of the effect. Okay, that is anything else that might be a contributor has got to be ruled out. And this is where almost all our human data fall apart because we really need an experiment for this. Let me give an example. Hey, the number of churches and the amount of crime in cities correlates about 0.3. I'm wondering then, do churches cause crime? And I've given this example in odd settings where people said, no, but after you've been a victim of crime, you want to go to church. And I thought, well, that's an intriguing notion. But in fact, we have a third variable explanation, and I'm sure you can think of it, the size of the city. If there are more churches, there are more people. If there are more people, there's more crime. Not a stunning, outrageous causal explanation, but just a spurious correlation. Just two things that happen to go together because they both go with a third thing, and that is the source of these links among different types of drug use that I really want to emphasize, in part because I want to battle this idea that, oh, if we keep folks from using cannabis, then we're going to prevent all problem drug use. Truth be told, I'm at these occasional high school presentations where folks say, oh yeah, we heard cannabis causes heroin, so we huffed gas. And I was just like, wow, no, please, oh God, right? The inhalants are markedly worse than anything cannabis is going to do. And again, I'm down on adolescent cannabis use, but truth be told, this is not the way to prevent drug problems simply by throwing people in jail or by telling lies to teenagers. My hearty thanks to Dr. Melissa Slavin, who was in my lab for years, and she made this slide just talking about the associations between marijuana and harder drugs. It's not strong. I rarely see anything above 0.25 or so. You guys know that a correlation goes from -1 to +1, but national survey data correlation between marijuana and crack use was around 0.02, I think, at best, right? And occasionally we see, even if we're 0.20, we're talking about accounting for 4% of the variance. It's clearly not that using cannabis is a big contributor to subsequent crack use. And when we think about just the rates of use, it's pretty obvious, right? How many injection heroin addicts do we even have in the United States anymore? It's probably 6 million, right? How many Americans have tried cannabis? Probably about 100 million, all right? So if the gateway is there, that gate's not open very big. And again, thanks to Dr. Melissa Slavin, the cannabis consumption must proceed. That's what the temporal antecedents is all about. And when I reviewed these papers in the early 2000s, I couldn't help but notice, if you look really closely on almost any human paper with gateway in the title, you find an intriguing little footnote, and it says, oh, by the way, anybody who used hard drugs first, we just threw them out of the sample. And I mean, that Allen Ginsberg joke I was saying before, yeah, okay, Allen Ginsberg did heroin and then it led to cannabis. Some folks don't use cannabis before they use hard drugs. And here are just 3 studies from the 90s where folks actually used hard drugs first. These were all samples of folks who were in treatment for drug problems. And obviously, the big contributor, of course, is what neighborhood did you grow up in? This Blaze Temple, I think I can remember the name Blaze for these data. The Blaze Temple study was a study of folks who happened to be in crack neighborhoods. So crack was markedly more available, and truth be told, the accessibility of the drug is far and away one of the best predictors of its use. So with that in mind, we really need to say it's isolated, right? Other explanations do not account for the association. There's got to be some third variable that we make sure we rule out. And the only way to do that would be to randomly assign people, here, you go smoke pot, you don't, you go, you don't, you do, you don't, right? And we'll come back in 10 years, keep it up, right? It's just not uh, the kind of thing I can get the ethics board to approve lately. And even the animal work where we think, oh, well, animals, they don't have any rights, let's just do it to them, right? It's really hard, and I'll get into that, but clearly there are no randomized control trials to make any sense of this. Oh, well, so you guys may know the expression post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this, and that's a logical error. Just because something comes second doesn't mean the thing that happened first was the cause. And this is just me making fun of it. Post pot ergo propter pot. I should thank Miss Sniffen for teaching me Latin in the first place, and John Houghton for, I believe, making this joke to me the first time. Well, so yeah, what's going on in the animal literature here? And again, part of the problem is rodents don't really like THC. Like, it's kind of a bum out. It doesn't just give them the munchies. It makes them really paranoid. They think there's an eagle around. Like, it's not a chemical that they're going to self-administer, except under some really mutated, deviant circumstances. We have seen data where a squirrel monkey, if you literally like make it so that there's nothing else to do, the THC exposed ones will be more likely to self-administer cocaine than the ones who weren't previously exposed to THC. But man, it's first of all just brutally horrible from an ethical standpoint, and not something that I think is going to generalize to anybody's real life, in part because there's no alternative behavior. There's nothing else these poor monkeys can do. And then the effect sizes are often statistically significant, but I'm not sure what to make of them. So with that in mind, Melissa said, THC can act as an effective reinforcer of drug-taking behavior in monkeys with no history of exposure to other drugs, suggesting that self-administration of THC by monkeys provides a reliable animal model of human marijuana abuse. Yeah, I'm not thrilled with that, right? Nevertheless, the big idea is, okay, if this is our model, maybe there is something chemically going on, but I'm questioning the external validity of this. Here's another study that was done where basically they just had to have a non-drug substitute, right? As long as there was anything else to entertain the rodents. In fact, their heroin escalation was nowhere near as bad. On the study, they had 4 different kinds of rat chow or only one, right? And heroin in both, right? And the guys who had 4 kinds of rat chow had something else to do, right? My friend Stanton Peele goes on and on about some of the studies where the rats have this, kick-ass, wonderful Disneyland place to play, or they're just in a horrible cage by themselves. Guess who ends up doing a whole lot of the opiates if they're available? But what's really going on here is there's one underlying thing that I think accounts for all of this. I'm going to call it sensation seeking in this slide. But basically, if you can imagine a personality trait, shout out, folks. We stand in line to be in the front car of the roller coaster. We're more than willing to spend a little extra money to get to do wild and fun things like jump out of an airplane or go on an adventure, And what a surprise, these folks often account for all the correlations between cannabis and hard drug use, because data suggests that at least half, depending upon whose data you're looking at, a third to a half of the folks who use cannabis don't even start using cannabis regularly, right? So somebody's got to be accounting for these links, and it's the folks who are the most disinhibited, the most fun-loving, right? The other thing is I feel like caffeine, alcohol, and nicotine have all been kind of neglected in this sense, and you cannot tell. If anything was the gateway drug, it was probably becoming a regular cigarette smoker early in life, just because you're kind of taking on this deviant identity. You're going to be hanging around with the kids who also have deviant identities, and then that may account for an introduction to hard drugs. And unfortunately, with cannabis in the hard drug market, anytime you were purchasing cannabis, you could potentially be exposed to that as well. All right, I'm going to get into some comparing across different countries to try to make some of these arguments, but I don't want to lose my slides here, so I'm just going to record it right here. All right, so pick it up on Gateway 2. Thanks for tuning in.